There is a moment in almost every sales conversation where the seller starts talking faster. They list features. They stack benefits. They explain options, upgrades, integrations, specifications. They believe that more information will create more certainty. But what often happens instead is the opposite. The buyer grows quiet. Their energy pulls back. They stop asking questions. They nod, but they don't commit. And the seller walks away confused, thinking, I explained everything. Why didn't it land?
Today, we're going to talk about why.
Feature-loaded pitches don't make a sale. Not because the product is bad, not because the price is wrong, but because the human brain does not decide the way sellers think it does. And once you understand this, selling stops feeling like persuasion and starts feeling like alignment. Let's begin with a simple truth. People don't buy features. They buy clarity. They don't buy information. They buy understanding. They don't buy complexity. They buy relief. Yet most sales pitches are built as if the buyer is a spreadsheet instead of a human being. We're taught that confidence means knowing everything, that professionalism means explaining everything, that value means listing everything. So we build presentations packed with details. We memorize talking points. We lead with what the product does instead of what the buyer experiences. And then we wonder why people hesitate. Here's the problem. Features are not meaning. They are raw material. And raw material doesn't create decisions. Interpretation does. When a buyer hears feature after feature, their brain is forced to work harder. They must translate. They must compare. They must imagine outcomes on their own. And when the brain works too hard, it doesn't say yes. It says, not now. Cognitive overload is one of the fastest ways to kill a sale because decision-making requires clarity, not volume. Think about the last time you were overwhelmed with choices. A menu with too many options. A website with too many tabs. A salesperson who kept talking. Even after you understood the point, what happened inside you? You didn't feel informed. You felt tired. That same thing happens in feature-heavy sales pitches. The buyer stops processing. They stop visualizing. They stop emotionally engaging. And once emotion disconnects, logic alone cannot close the gap. Because buying is not logical first. It is emotional first, then justified with logic later. Features appeal to logic. But logic does not initiate movement. Emotion does. This is why two products with nearly identical features can perform wildly differently in the market. One creates resonance. The other creates confusion. The difference isn't the product. It's the story the buyer tells themselves about what life looks like after the purchase. Features don't tell that story. Outcomes do. Let's talk about the illusion of safety. Many sellers lean on features because it feels safer. If I explain everything, I can't be blamed. If I show how advanced this is, they'll see the value. If I list enough reasons, one of them will stick. But this is not confidence. This is self-protection. Feature loading is often a defense mechanism. It's a way to avoid silence, a way to avoid vulnerability, a way to avoid asking deeper questions. Because asking deeper questions means you might discover the product isn't the right fit, and that can feel uncomfortable. But discomfort is not the enemy of sales. Avoidance is. When sellers hide behind features, they unintentionally shift the burden of meaning onto the buyer. They say, without realizing it, here's everything. You figure out why it matters. And most buyers won't. Not because they're incapable, but because they didn't come to you for more information. They came for clarity. Let's look at how buyers actually decide. When someone considers a purchase, their mind is quietly asking 3 questions. Do you understand my problem? Do I trust you? Can I see myself on the other side of this decision? Features answer none of these questions directly. Understanding comes from empathy. Trust comes from calm confidence. Vision comes from outcomes. A feature-loaded pitch jumps ahead to explanation before understanding has been established. And when understanding is missing, Everything else feels irrelevant. Imagine going to a doctor. You sit down and say, "I haven't been sleeping." And instead of asking questions, the doctor launches into a detailed explanation of pharmaceutical compounds, dosage variations, chemical pathways, and side effects. Even if they're correct,
You don't feel helped.
you feel unseen. That's what feature-heavy selling does. It explains before it connects. And connection is the gateway to influence. Another reason features don't sell is because they blur differentiation. Ironically, the more features you list, the more interchangeable you become. Because most competitors have similar features. Different names, slight variations, same core functionality. When you lead with features, you invite comparison. And comparison almost always turns into price pressure. But when you lead with perspective, comparison becomes irrelevant. When you articulate a problem the buyer hasn't fully named yet, you separate yourself immediately. When you describe an outcome they've been wanting but couldn't quite explain, you create authority. Authority doesn't come from knowing more. It comes from seeing more clearly. The strongest sellers don't sound impressive. They sound precise. They don't say more. They say what matters. They slow the conversation down. They leave space. They let the buyer feel understood. And then, only then, they introduce features. As support, not substance. Features should reinforce a decision, not create one. Think of features as evidence. Evidence comes after belief, not before it. Once a buyer believes, features feel reassuring. Before belief, features feel overwhelming. This is why timing matters more than content. The same feature that excites someone at the right moment will bore or confuse them at the wrong one. So, what replaces a feature-loaded pitch? Clarity-based selling. Clarity-based selling starts with context. It answers why this matters,
Why now?
why this approach. Instead of listing what something does, it explains what changes. Instead of describing mechanics, it describes movement. Instead of pushing information, it pulls understanding forward. Clarity speaks in outcomes, not vague promises, but tangible shifts. Less stress, more control, fewer mistakes, faster decisions,
Better sleep.
stronger results. Clarity allows the buyer to mentally step into the future. Features keep them stuck in the present. And the brain decides based on future identity, not current data. This is also why great sales conversations feel calm. There is no rush to convince, no urgency to impress, because the seller trusts that if the value is clear, the decision will follow. Pressure often shows up when features are doing work they were never meant to do, trying to replace confidence, trying to replace alignment, trying to replace belief. But features can't carry that weight. Only clarity can. Let's talk about silence. Silence is terrifying for feature-based sellers because silence feels like rejection.
So they fill it.
They add another feature, another example, another explanation. But silence is where decisions form. When a buyer goes quiet, they're not disengaging. They're integrating. And integration requires space. The best sellers don't interrupt integration. They respect it. They wait. They trust the process. Feature-heavy pitches interrupt thinking. Clarity-based conversations support it. There's also a deeper issue at play. Feature-loaded pitches often center the product instead of the person. They make selling about performance. Did I explain it well? Did I say the right things? Did I cover everything? But effective selling is not a performance. It's a service. It's about helping someone see their situation more clearly than they could on their own. That requires listening, more than talking, curiosity, more than certainty, presence, more than polish. When selling becomes about helping someone decide, even if that decision is no, trust increases. And trust is the true multiplier in sales. You can have the best product in the world and still struggle if your message creates confusion. And you can have a simple product that sells effortlessly if your message creates clarity. This is why minimalism often wins. Not because less is better, but because focus is better. A single clear idea beats 10 impressive features every time. So the next time you're tempted to list everything your product does,
Pause.
ask yourself, what problem does this solve? What outcome does this create? What changes for this person? And say that instead. Let features support the story, not replace it. Because sales is not about information transfer. It's about transformation. And transformation is never communicated through a list. It's communicated through clarity, confidence, and connection. Feature-loaded pitches don't fail because features are bad. They fail because they ask the buyer to do too much work. The best sellers do the work for them. They translate complexity into meaning. They reduce noise into signal. They turn information into insight. And when that happens, selling doesn't feel like selling. It feels like guidance. It feels natural. It feels human. And that is what actually makes the sale.